The galaxy was a vast and complicated place, full of different civilizations that had learned to live together in uneasy peace. For years there had been treaties, negotiations, and councils where leaders of different races gathered to discuss problems. Every race thought of itself as important, but only one race carried a strange mix of fear and respect wherever they went: the humans. They were often called Deathworlders. The word itself had a weight that made many aliens uneasy. To them, Earth was a dangerous place, a planet where storms, diseases, predators, and disasters constantly tested its inhabitants. For aliens who grew up on calm, stable planets, the idea of surviving such a world was terrifying. And yet humanity not only survived, they thrived. They built cities, invented technologies, and reached the stars. Some alien races saw them as miraculous survivors, others as dangerous monsters who were too unpredictable to trust. When the Great Council summoned representatives from all civilizations to a neutral station, there was tension even before the meeting began. The station floated between two stars, shining brightly against the blackness of space. It was a place meant to symbolize fairness, where no single race had control. But everyone knew the gathering would not be peaceful. Resources were running low in several star systems, and accusations of theft and greed had already spread across the galaxy. The humans sent one of their most respected envoys, a man who had lived through wars on his own world and had learned patience. He did not wear flashy armor or glowing jewels like some alien leaders. Instead, he carried himself with quiet confidence, dressed in simple clothes. But his eyes held the sharpness of someone who had seen both kindness and cruelty. Other envoys watched him closely, whispering to each other, some curious, others nervous. Among the aliens present was a commander from a proud and powerful species. His kind had dominated their region of the galaxy for centuries, and they did not like the growing influence of humans. They believed humans were nothing more than savages dressed in the clothes of civilization. The commander was known for his arrogance, his temper, and his love of humiliation. For him, this council was not about negotiation, it was about proving superiority. The chamber where the leaders gathered was enormous, built with soaring ceilings and glowing walls that pulsed faintly like veins of light. The long table stretched across the center, each seat marked with the insignia of a race. As the discussions began, voices rose and fell, each leader trying to defend their own people. Some spoke calmly, others shouted accusations. But throughout it all, the human envoy remained steady, his voice firm but controlled, choosing his words carefully. This calmness did not please the alien commander. To him, silence looked like weakness. Every time the human spoke, the commander would interrupt with laughter or sharp remarks. At first, the human ignored it, focusing on the larger purpose of the meeting. But slowly, the tension grew. The commander leaned back in his seat, eyes glowing with cruel amusement as if waiting for the right moment to strike. It happened when the humans suggested a fair solution to share resources equally. The commander slammed his hand on the table, mocking the idea as foolish. "You speak as though you are wiser than us all," he sneered in his guttural voice. "But you come from a planet where even your own skies try to kill you. You are not wise. You are merely stubborn beasts who survived by accident." A few other envoys shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some wanted to stop him, but none spoke. Insults between races were not uncommon, but this one cut deep. The human envoy kept his composure, though his jaw tightened slightly. He answered with calm dignity, reminding the council that humanity had proven its worth many times and sought only fairness, not domination. But the commander was not finished. He rose from his chair, walked around the table, and stood before the human envoy. The chamber grew silent. Every eye watched. The commander's towering figure loomed above the human. Then with a swift motion, he raised his hand and struck the envoy across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. Gasps filled the air. Several envoys froze in shock, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. No one had ever dared to touch a Deathworlder in such a way. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The commander sneered, certain he had humiliated the human before the entire council. He turned slightly as if expecting applause or agreement from the others. Some envoys lowered their eyes, unwilling to take sides. Others stared, waiting to see what would happen next. The human envoy did not move at first. He simply sat there, the red mark of the slap glowing faintly on his cheek. His expression was calm, almost too calm, There was no anger in his eyes, no raised voice, no wild movement. He simply looked at the commander with steady, unblinking focus. That silence was heavier than any shout. It made even the bravest of the alien envoys uneasy. They had heard the stories of humans. They had heard how quickly they could turn from patient diplomats into relentless warriors. They had heard of their endurance, their ability to fight long after others had fallen. And now in that silence, those stories felt frighteningly real. The commander, however, mistook the quiet for fear. He laughed loudly, his voice filling the chamber. "See?" he announced to the others. The so-called Deathworlder bows his head when struck. They are nothing but myths, weak creatures hiding behind legends. But deep down, some of the other leaders knew better. They watched the human envoy's stillness, the way his hand slowly curled into a fist under the table. They noticed how his breathing steadied, how his eyes grew colder. This was not weakness. This was the kind of calm that came before a storm. In that moment, the fate of the Council, and perhaps the entire galaxy, shifted. What began as a simple insult was about to turn into a lesson none of them would ever forget. The air in the chamber grew heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every envoy knew they were about to witness something that would be remembered for generations. The commander stood tall, proud of his action, while the human sat perfectly still, preparing for what came next. And in that quiet, the seeds of fear, respect, and change were planted in every heart present. The silence after the slap was almost unbearable. The sound of it still seemed to linger in the air, bouncing against the high walls of the chamber. Every representative sitting around the long table had gone still, as if even breathing too loudly might provoke something none of them wanted to face. The commander's face twisted into a smug smile, his chest swelling with pride at what he thought was a moment of triumph. To him, humiliating a human in front of the most powerful leaders of the galaxy was the ultimate victory. He had always believed that humans were nothing more than dangerous animals dressed in the clothing of civilization, and this was his proof. He raised his chin high, certain that others would share his laughter, but no one laughed. Some alien leaders lowered their gazes to the floor, ashamed but unwilling to intervene. Others sat stiff, their eyes darting between the commander and the human envoy, waiting to see what would unfold. The silence was so sharp that even the faint hum of the station's life support system seemed loud. The human sat quietly, his cheek still red from the strike. He did not cry out, he did not move to wipe the mark away. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on the commander, and that look was unlike anything the other delegates had ever seen. It wasn't anger that burned in his gaze, it was something deeper, something colder. It was the kind of look that promised consequences far beyond the moment. A few of the envoys exchanged nervous glances. They had heard stories about Deathworlders, tales told in whispers about soldiers who fought until their last breath, about explorers who crossed deadly lands with nothing but grit and determination. They knew that humans had a limit to their patience, and once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. Still, the commander mistook silence for submission. He barked out a laugh, loud and cruel, and spread his arms as if presenting a show to the council. "Look at this creature," he boomed, his voice echoing through the chamber. So much fear wrapped in flesh. They speak of honor, of courage, but when touched, they cower like beaten pets. This is the true face of the Deathworlder, myths and legends, nothing more. His words stung more than the slap itself. They carried an arrogance so sharp that even those who disliked humans found themselves uneasy. No one wanted to admit it out loud, but deep inside they feared what would happen next. The human envoy finally moved. Slowly, with deliberate calm, he rose from his chair. His movements were quiet but carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. He stood face to face with the commander, though the alien was larger, broader, and stronger in appearance. For a brief moment, the two stared at each other in silence, a duel of wills playing out in front of the entire council. The envoy's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady. "Respect is not given by force," he said. "It is earned. You think a slap proves strength, but all it proves is your fear of what you do not understand." The commander snarled, his pride pricked by the calm response. He stepped closer, his breath hot, his expression wild with mockery. "Fear?" he spat. "You are the ones who should fear. You think your stories frighten us, but I will show the galaxy the truth. You are nothing. And today I prove it." The human did not flinch. His eyes stayed locked, unblinking, holding the commander's gaze with a kind of resolve that seemed unshakable. Around them, the council remained frozen, torn between intervention and the dread of making things worse. No one dared to step in. The atmosphere was a storm waiting to break, and everyone knew the smallest spark would set it off. The commander, growing impatient with the lack of reaction, lifted his arm again. His intent was clear. Another strike, harder this time, a final humiliation to end the charade. But before his hand could fall, the human's body shifted ever so slightly. A subtle readiness that only those watching closely could see. It was not aggression yet, but preparation, like the tightening of a bowstring before release. One of the envoys, a quiet observer from a distant system, whispered under his breath, "He doesn't understand. He has no idea what he's unleashed." His words were not meant to be heard, but the tension was so great that they seemed to hang in the air. The commander either didn't notice or didn't care. His arrogance blinded him to the warning signs. To him, this was still a game, a chance to show dominance in front of the galaxy's rulers. He believed that by breaking a human in front of everyone, he would send a message that his people alone deserved respect and obedience. But the other envoys could see the mistake. They could see it in the human stillness, in the way his breathing had slowed, in the way his eyes no longer held patience but something sharper. It was not rage. It was not recklessness. It was decision. The chamber, vast as it was, suddenly felt small, as though its walls were closing in. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum, each second dragging longer than the last. The commander raised his voice again, taunting, ridiculing, daring the human to react. And then, for the first time since the slap, the human moved with purpose. His head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing, and his hand rested on the hilt of the blade at his side. It was not drawn, not yet, but the gesture alone sent a ripple of unease across the room. Every envoy shifted, their instincts warning them that they were standing on the edge of something monumental. The commander laughed again, mistaking the gesture for desperation. "Yes," he said mockingly, "show your true face at last. Violence, always violence. That is all you know." The human did not answer. He simply stood calm as stone, his silence louder than any words could ever be. His composure was not weakness, it was control, the kind that frightened even the bravest soldiers, because it meant that when the time came, he would strike with precision, not recklessness. The council chamber, once a place of negotiation, had become an arena. Every envoy could feel it, the balance of power teetering on the edge of a blade. They knew that what was about to happen would not stay within these walls. It would ripple outward, carried across star systems, whispered through space stations, written into history. The commander, drunk on his own pride, could not see it. To him, this was still his moment, a performance for the galaxy. But to everyone else it was clear. This was no longer about insults, no longer about pride. This was about survival, respect, and a warning the galaxy would never forget. The human's hand tightened on the hilt of his weapon, and in that instant, every envoy leaned forward, unable to look away. Some clenched their fists in fear, others in anticipation. They knew they were standing at the edge of a story that would be told for centuries. The commander smirked, still blind to the truth, and raised his arm high for the final blow. And at that very moment, the galaxy held its breath. The commander's hand rose high, ready to strike again, but the moment never came. Before the blow could land, the human envoy moved with a speed that no one in the chamber had expected. For a heartbeat, it was as though time slowed, and the only sound was the hiss of steel leaving its sheath. In one fluid motion, the blade was drawn. It glimmered under the chamber's pale lights, sharp and clean, and then it cut through the air with deadly precision. The commander's mocking grin froze on his face, his eyes widening with shock, but it was already too late. The strike was swift, final, and silent. The alien's head was severed in an instant, falling from his shoulders before anyone had even gasped. The sound it made when it hit the polished floor was louder than any shout, a dull, rolling thud that echoed across the vast chamber. The body collapsed a second later, heavy and lifeless, crumpling to the ground. Silence followed. The kind of silence that was so thick it pressed on the chest of every being present. For several long seconds no one moved. No one even breathed. The entire council stared in stunned disbelief, their minds struggling to accept what their eyes had just seen. The human envoy did not waver. He stood tall, blade in hand, his breathing steady, his eyes cold and unwavering. There was no gloating, no anger written across his face, only resolve, the kind that came from a choice made without hesitation. He had warned them, not in words but in his silence. Now the warning had become action. Some of the envoys gasped quietly, covering their mouths with trembling hands. Others leaned back in their chairs, their eyes wide with terror. A few, though shocked, watched with a strange kind of respect, as though they had just witnessed a truth that had always been whispered but never proven. The severed head rolled a few more inches across the polished floor before it stopped, its lifeless eyes staring blankly upward. It was a sight that no one in that room would ever forget. The commander had believed the slap was a show of power, but now it was his downfall. His arrogance had blinded him, and the galaxy had seen the cost. The human envoy lowered his blade slowly, the sharp metal glinting as he returned it to its sheath with calm precision. There was no rush in his movements, no wild display. It was done, and that was enough. He then turned his gaze to the rest of the council, his expression unreadable but his presence unshakable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried across the chamber with a weight that silenced even the whispers. "Respect is not demanded," he said, "and it is not given by force. But it is never taken lightly. Remember this moment and understand, humanity bows to no hand raised against it." His words hung in the air like a blade suspended above every head. The envoys exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked horrified, their minds already racing with the possible consequences. Others nodded faintly, as if they understood something deeper, something that had been proven beyond all doubt, that humans were not to be tested with insults or humiliation. One envoy, his voice trembling, finally spoke. He killed him. "Before our very eyes," another replied, quieter but steadier. "No, he defended himself." The commander struck first and struck with pride. The human warned him without words. We all saw it. We all chose silence. The chamber grew heavy again, this time not with fear of what would happen, but with the weight of realization. They had witnessed not just an act of violence, but a lesson written in blood. The human did not linger on their stares. He adjusted his stance, shoulders straight, and walked back to his chair. He sat down calmly, as though nothing more needed to be said. His composure was unnerving to those who still trembled, but to others, it was a sign of control that no one else in the galaxy could claim. The commander's body was eventually removed, carried away by silent attendants. The head was taken too, though the image of it lying on the floor was burned into every mind present. No one doubted that the story of this moment would spread beyond the chamber, beyond the station, across the stars themselves. For now, though the council remained seated, their voices muted, their courage drained. No one dared to speak against the human envoy, not after what they had just seen. Some wanted to end the meeting altogether, but others knew that leaving now would show weakness, and so they stayed, silent, restless, waiting for someone to speak the first word. At last, one of the elder envoys, who had lived through many wars and betrayals, leaned forward. His voice was rough, steady, but carrying the weight of years. "The galaxy has learned something today. Let it be remembered. If you treat a Deathworlder with contempt, you pay the price. Let us not make that mistake again." There was no argument. No one dared to challenge his words. The human envoy did not smile, did not relax. He sat there calm as ever, but inside his mind thoughts swirled. He had not wanted violence. He had come to this place to negotiate, to build peace, to show that humans could be partners, not enemies. But the line had been crossed, and when it was crossed, there had been no other choice. The act was not for himself alone. It was for every human across the stars, for every child, every family, every worker who deserved to be treated with dignity. He knew the galaxy respected strength, and in their language, strength was sometimes the only thing they understood. Still, he did not let pride swell inside him. What he had done would echo, not only as a warning but also as a test. Some would fear humans more deeply now. Others would see them as dangerous threats, and still others might come seeking alliances out of respect. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The galaxy would never look at Earth the same way again. The silence in the chamber lasted longer than any meeting in memory. It was not broken by shouting, not by new arguments, but by the quiet, heavy agreement that nothing would be the same after today. Far away, beyond the walls of the council chamber, beyond the orbit of the station, stars burned silently, unaware that history had just shifted. A single moment, a single decision had changed the balance of power, and though no one spoke it aloud, every envoy knew the truth. The commander's arrogance had been his downfall, but the human's restraint had been his power, for he could have done much more, and yet he had chosen only one strike, one life, one lesson. That choice spoke louder than 1,000 battles. As the envoys eventually rose from their seats and the chamber slowly emptied, they carried with them the image of the severed head, the sound of the blade, and the weight of the human's words. They would return to their worlds and tell their people what they had seen, and in every retelling the story would grow sharper, stronger, more unshakable. The galaxy had witnessed something it would never forget, and the Deathworlder sat in silence, knowing that his people's future had been written not with ink, but with steel. The chamber where the alien commander had fallen was still heavy with silence, long after the body had been removed. But silence does not last forever. Secrets cannot stay hidden in a galaxy filled with eyes, ears, and voices eager to carry news across the stars. What had happened inside that hall was too great, too unforgettable to remain contained within its walls. It spilled outward like water breaking through a dam. At first it was whispers. Envoys returning to their ships carried the memory of what they had seen in their shaken voices. They spoke to their advisors in hushed tones, their words uncertain, as though saying them out loud might bring the image back too vividly. The human struck him down, some said, with a single motion faster than anyone could stop. Others repeated the envoy's words. Respect is not demanded, but it is never taken lightly. Those words carried almost as much power as the strike itself. Within hours, messages began to flow from ship to ship, station to station. By the next day, the story had spread across neighboring systems, and by the end of the week, it had reached the far edges of the galaxy. But as with all stories, the truth twisted and grew in the retelling. Some described the human as a calm and just figure who defended his honor only when there was no other choice. Others painted him as a ruthless executioner who drew his blade without hesitation. In some versions, the commander had insulted humanity for years, and this was the final straw. In others, the strike was described as so fast that no one even saw the blade move, only the head falling to the floor. Every world had its own way of telling the story, but the core remained the same. An alien commander struck a Deathworlder, and within 5 seconds, his severed head lay on the ground for all to see. On planets where humans had been treated with suspicion, the news spread fear. Leaders called secret meetings, discussing whether to cut ties with Earth entirely or to approach them with greater caution. Soldiers on those worlds whispered nervously, wondering if they would ever face humans in battle and whether survival would even be possible if they did. Parents warned their children to show respect if they ever saw a human, even from afar. On other worlds, the story spread like wildfire among common people, not just leaders. Some admired the strength and courage of the envoy, calling him a symbol of honor. They said that he had defended not just himself but the dignity of his entire species. Among oppressed groups across the galaxy, his actions became a quiet inspiration, proof that even in the face of arrogance and cruelty, one could stand firm and demand respect. Merchants on trading routes began to whisper too. Deals were made with more care whenever humans were involved. No one wanted to be the fool who crossed a Deathworlder and risked meeting the same fate as the commander. Even in markets far from Earth, the presence of a single human buyer was enough to hush voices and straighten postures. The lesson had spread. Tread carefully. Of course, not all reactions were respectful. There were leaders who raged in private, calling the act barbaric. They demanded that humanity be punished, expelled from the council, perhaps even crushed before their influence grew too strong. But even among these voices there was hesitation. The image of the severed head weighed heavily on their minds, and though they spoke of punishment, their actions were slower, quieter. They knew that open defiance could cost them more than they were willing to lose. The galaxy thrives on symbols, and soon the commander's downfall became one. In some places, artists carved statues of a faceless warrior holding a blade, meant to represent the envoy's unshakable courage. In others, the event was retold in songs and stories, each version shaping the human envoy into something larger than life. To some, he was a monster to be feared. To others, he was a hero to be admired. Even among humans themselves, the reaction was divided. On Earth and its colonies, people debated endlessly. Some were proud, saying the envoy had done what was right, that no one should accept humiliation in silence. They said his act was not violence, but justice. Others worried that the strike had made enemies of powerful civilizations, that instead of building trust, it had built walls of fear. Families gathered around screens, watching retellings of the event, wondering how this single action would shape their children's future. But whatever the opinion, one truth was undeniable. The galaxy could no longer ignore humanity. They had been outsiders, seen as newcomers in the grand stage of interstellar politics. Now they were at the center of every discussion, every calculation. The act of a single envoy had changed the balance of power in ways no treaty or negotiation could have. In the weeks that followed, more envoys from other races arrived on Earth or sought out humans on neutral stations. Some came with offerings of peace, hoping to strengthen ties before humanity grew too distant. Others came with cautious questions, testing the waters to see if cooperation was still possible. Even those who disliked humans approached with more care than ever before. The story also reached darker corners of the galaxy. Pirates, mercenaries, and warlords whispered about the human envoy with a mix of fear and curiosity. Some vowed never to cross a Deathworlder. Others foolishly dreamed of proving themselves by challenging one. But deep inside, most knew it was better to avoid that fate entirely. In diplomatic halls, the incident became known as the strike. It was spoken of in hushed voices, always carrying a weight of respect, even among those who pretended to despise humans. Councils debated endlessly on how to respond, but most reached the same conclusion. Nothing could undo what had already been done. They could only adapt. The severed head of the commander, though taken from the council chamber, became a ghostly image that haunted the galaxy's imagination. It appeared in drawings, in whispered descriptions, and symbols carved into walls. It was not the death itself that echoed, but the meaning behind it, that no matter how powerful or arrogant one thought they were, disrespecting a Deathworlder came at the highest cost. Even in remote colonies where news arrived late, the story was told with awe. Farmers in distant fields, miners working deep under alien suns, travelers crossing barren deserts on lonely worlds, all of them spoke of the envoy who had stood his ground. The story gave them something to hold on to, the idea that dignity could be defended, that respect could not be stolen no matter the odds, and so, a single act that had lasted no more than a few seconds became a turning point. It was no longer just the story of one man and one commander. It was a story of humanity itself, written into the stars with the sound of steel and silence. Across the galaxy, leaders, soldiers, and common folk alike began to look at humans differently. They were no longer the strange outsiders from a dangerous world. They were a people who demanded respect, who would not bend to humiliation, who would stand tall even when surrounded by the most powerful. The envoy himself, sitting in quiet reflection, knew this truth better than anyone. He had not sought fame, nor fear, nor legend, but he understood that what he had done could not be undone, and that it would follow humanity wherever they went. It was no longer just his burden. It was a symbol for his entire race. And as the galaxy continued to talk, argue, and speculate, one truth settled into every mind like a stone. The age of underestimating humans was over. The chamber was still heavy with silence long after the commander's head had fallen. Days had passed, but the image of that single moment still echoed across the galaxy. No one forgot the sharp movement of the Deathworlder's hand, the clean strike of his blade, and the chilling calmness that followed. To some it was brutality, to others it was justice, but to everyone it was unforgettable. Across the stars, news channels replayed the event again and again. Not a single word was needed. The scene spoke louder than any speech. The arrogance of the commander, the slap across the human's face, and the swift end that came only seconds later. It became the most watched moment in galactic history. For the first time, aliens who had doubted humans finally understood why they were called Deathworlders. On Earth, the story reached every corner of the planet. People watched with mixed emotions. Some were proud that humanity had finally shown its strength without hesitation. Others were worried about what this act might bring. Would the galaxy fear them now? Would other races rise against them, seeing humans as uncontrollable? But no matter what side people were on, everyone felt the same thing deep inside. A new chapter had begun. The man who had acted, the one who stood calm after taking the commander's life, returned to Earth quietly. There were no parades, no celebrations. He did not see himself as a hero. He was a soldier who had defended respect, nothing more. When asked by his own people why he had done it, his answer was simple. A man can endure many things, but not humiliation that threatens his people. His words spread across Earth just as quickly as his action had spread across the galaxy. But beyond Earth, things were more complicated. In one part of the galaxy, alien leaders were horrified. They called emergency meetings. They said humans were dangerous, too violent, too unpredictable. They spoke about banning Earth from future councils, about isolating humanity before things got out of hand. Their fear was real, and they were not wrong. Humans were indeed dangerous, but not in the way they imagined. They were dangerous because they would never kneel when pushed down. Yet in another part of the galaxy, the reaction was very different. Some races admired the humans. They whispered that finally, someone had stood up to the arrogance of the commander who had bullied smaller species for years. They saw in humans not monsters, but protectors. A few even sent private messages to Earth asking for alliances, for trade, for protection. It was as if the galaxy was suddenly split into two halves. One half fearing the Deathworlders, the other half hoping to stand beside them. The severed head of the commander became more than just a gruesome image. It became a symbol. For those who hated humans, it was a warning sign painted in blood. For those who admired them, it was a beacon of strength. And for the common people across the stars, ordinary workers, farmers, and families, it was a reminder that even the most powerful leaders could fall in the blink of an eye if they disrespected the wrong people. As time passed, the story grew beyond the facts. Some said the Deathworlder's blade had glowed like fire. Others claimed he hadn't even moved, that his enemy's head had fallen off by fear alone. Legends grew from that single strike, as legends often do when truth and awe mix together. But the man himself never corrected anyone. He stayed silent, living simply, refusing interviews, refusing fame. He had done his duty, and for him that was enough. But the galaxy was no longer the same. In future meetings, no one dared raise their voice against humans. Whenever they walked into a chamber, silence followed, and eyes turned toward them with respect and fear. Even those who hated them lowered their heads, not because they wanted to, but because they remembered what had happened the last time someone dared to raise a hand against a Deathworlder. This quiet respect gave humans something they had never truly had before: influence. For the first time, Earth's voice mattered. When they spoke in the councils, others listened. When they made requests, others considered them seriously. No one wanted to risk another incident. In a strange way, one man's act of defense had shifted the balance of power across the stars. Still, not everyone was at peace. The allies of the slain commander wanted revenge. Secret plans were made in dark rooms, whispers of assassins and fleets being prepared. But every time someone suggested striking back, others hesitated. "Do you really want to face a Deathworlder?" became a question that stopped many in their tracks. Fear was a powerful chain, and it held back those who once thought themselves fearless. Back on Earth, the soldier lived quietly. He did not see himself as the one who had changed the galaxy. He saw himself as a man who had simply refused disrespect. But people around him knew the truth. Sometimes a single act defines an entire era. Sometimes one choice changes everything. As the months turned into years, Earth's reputation grew stronger. Where once they had been ignored, now they were treated as equals. Where once their warnings had been dismissed, now they carried weight. Other races learned that humans were not to be mocked, not to be tested lightly. And so, without seeking it, humanity found itself at the center of galactic affairs. But perhaps the most important change was not political. It was in the hearts of ordinary people across the galaxy. Small races, often bullied or ignored, began to lift their heads a little higher. They looked at the humans and thought, if they can stand up to power, maybe we can too. And slowly, courage began to spread in places where fear had lived for centuries. That was the true legacy of the Deathworlder's strike. Not the fear, not the blood, not the severed head on the council floor, but the reminder that no one, no matter how small, had to bow forever. Respect had to be mutual, or it would be taken by force. In the end, the galaxy did not collapse into war as some feared. It reshaped itself into something new, a place where humans were both feared and admired, avoided and sought after, and at the heart of it all stood a simple truth. Never again would anyone dare to raise a hand against a human envoy. And so, what began as an insult ended as a lesson that echoed across the stars. A single moment of arrogance had cost a commander his life, but it had also given birth to a new order. The galaxy had seen the strength of a Deathworlder, and from that day forward it would never forget.